Family sold me. 17 years later I came for revenge. The day my childhood ended. When I was 10 years old, my mother smiled at me for the last time. I remember her hand trembling as she brushed my hair and told me to be a good girl. I thought she was sending me somewhere safe. But the truth? That day, my family sold me. I can still hear the sound of the old van door slamming shut. The smell of gasoline, the taste of dust on my tongue, and my little heart pounding so loud it drowned out every thought. I called out for my mother, but she didn't look back. Not once. They had sold me to a man twice her age, a man who looked at me the way a butcher looks at meat. And my father? He didn't even come to say goodbye. That was the moment I stopped believing in love. That was the day my childhood ended. For years, I tried to make sense of it. Was it money? Was it desperation? Or was I just unwanted? The house I was taken to was far from everything I knew, a lonely farmhouse on the edge of nowhere. The man's wife, an older woman with eyes colder than ice, told me I was there to work for my keep. But I soon realized work meant something darker. Every chore, every command, every bruise, they were all reminders that I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was property. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, clutching the corner of an old blanket I had brought from home. It still smelled faintly of my mother. Sometimes, I'd whisper her name, hoping she could hear me, hoping she'd come back. But she never did. Nobody did. And yet, deep inside, a small part of me refused to die. That tiny spark whispered, "One day, you'll leave. One day, they'll pay." Before I tell you what happened next, if you're still here listening, don't forget to subscribe. Because what I'm about to share gets darker, deeper, and far more personal than you can imagine. You won't want to miss what comes next. Years passed, and I learned to stay quiet. I watched everything, the man's routines, the weak spots, the way the gates were locked at night. I memorized every sound the house made when everyone slept. I waited for a chance. But in the waiting, I also grew. I learned pain. I learned silence. And eventually, I learned control. There was one kind woman, her name was Rosa, who worked in the nearby fields. She noticed the marks on my arms, the way I flinched when someone raised a hand. One afternoon, she left me a small loaf of bread and whispered, "Don't let them break you." That single sentence saved me more than food ever could. I started hiding pieces of bread, scraps of fabric, little tools, anything I could use one day when I'd finally run. But every time I thought about escaping, I'd hear that man's footsteps echoing in my nightmares. He'd say, "You're mine now, little girl. Your family made sure of it." That sentence burned in my memory for years. Your family made sure of it. I didn't understand what he meant, not yet. But I would. One night, after a particularly harsh beating, I crawled to a corner of the cold floor, bleeding and shaking. I looked up at the cracked ceiling and whispered, "If I ever get out, I'll come back." Not as a girl. As their worst memory. And I meant every word. That promise became my oxygen. It kept me alive when I wanted to give up. It kept me human when pain tried to turn me into something else. If you've made it this far, take a moment to subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Every scar I carry has a story, and soon, every person who gave me one will face their turn. As the years passed, the world outside moved on. I grew taller, stronger, quieter. But inside, I was fire. Every insult, every bruise was another log on that fire. And when the time finally came, I was ready. At 17, I saw my chance. The man and his wife went into town, leaving the gate half open for the first time. I didn't even pack. I just ran. I ran barefoot across miles of gravel roads until my feet bled. Every breath felt like freedom cutting through my lungs. By sunrise, I reached a small village. A kind woman took me to the local authorities, and from there, my new life began. But as they cleaned my wounds and asked me questions, one thought kept echoing. My family did this. And someday, they'll see what I've become. Before I move on, make sure you subscribe, because when I tell you what happened after I escaped, you'll understand why revenge was never just a choice. It was destiny. I thought freedom meant peace. But freedom only gave me time to plan my revenge. The house of strangers. Freedom tasted like dust and blood. When I finally ran far enough to stop hearing his voice echo behind me, I realized something terrifying. I was free, yes, but I had nowhere to go. Freedom, it turns out, can be lonelier than captivity. The kind woman who found me by the roadside took me to a small shelter in the nearest town. I still remember her name, Lena. She had a warm smile and eyes that saw right through my silence. When she asked who my parents were, I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That my family sold me like cattle? So I just said, I don't have any. The officials came. They asked questions, filled out forms, took pictures of my bruises. They promised justice, promised help. But promises don't feed a starving soul. The world has a short memory for broken girls. After a few weeks, they placed me in a foster home, a small house owned by a couple named Margaret and Tom. They were kind, but kindness felt foreign to me. I didn't know how to respond to it. When Margaret hugged me for the first time, I froze. My body didn't know the language of love anymore. For months, I barely spoke. I avoided mirrors. I flinched at sudden noises. But slowly, painfully, I began to heal. Margaret would read me stories before bed, and Tom would leave little chocolates by my pillow. It was the first time in years I slept without fear. Still, every night, before closing my eyes, I whispered that same promise to myself. One day, I'll go back. I finished school while working part-time at a local cafe. Customers would tell me I had sad eyes, but a polite smile that never quite reached them. They didn't know the truth, those eyes had seen hell. They didn't need to know that behind every smile was a memory I was still trying to bury. At 18, I got my first job at a small legal office. The irony? I spent my days typing reports about justice, the very thing I never got. But life, as I learned, loves irony. The more I worked there, the more I understood the world, how people hide secrets behind laws, signatures, and fake kindness. And that's when I realized, if I ever wanted revenge, I couldn't do it as the broken girl they sold. I had to become someone powerful. Someone they'd never see coming. So I studied. I saved. I changed my name. No one knew I was the same girl from the farmhouse. No one needed to. That girl was dead. What remained was Evelyn Cross, sharp, poised, untraceable. The kind of woman who smiled in silence while planning her next move. One day, while cleaning out some old documents at the office, I came across a name that made my blood turn cold. Harper Lewis. It was the man who had bought me 17 years ago. The document showed he was under investigation for financial irregularities and human trafficking links. My hands shook as I held the paper. Fate had finally brought his name back to me. But what truly shattered me was the next page, a record showing he'd paid $5,000 to my parents. There it was. Proof that they sold me. My family didn't lose me. They sold me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in front of my mirror, staring at my reflection, whispering over and over. They did this to me. Every tear felt like fire, but behind that fire was steel. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a storm. And the storm was coming home. Before I could return, I needed to know why. Why would a mother sell her own child? Why would a father stand by? I spent months digging. I contacted old neighbors, searched public records, even hired someone to access sealed adoption files. And then I found it, a document stating that my mother had taken money from Harper Lewis not just once, but twice. The first time for me. The second, a year later, for my younger sister. They had sold her too. My heart stopped. I had a sister. And she was gone, just like me. Except this time, no one had found her. For weeks, I couldn't breathe. Every night I prayed, not for peace, but for vengeance. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for her. Years went by. I built a career in law, learned every system, every loophole. By the time I was 27, I was known for being ruthless, the woman who never lost a case. But inside, I was still that little girl with a scarred heart and unfinished business. The past was calling, and I was ready to answer. I tracked my parents down through public records. They were still living in the same broken house, older, poorer, pretending to be victims of fate. But I wasn't going to show up at their door yet. No. They didn't deserve to see me until they felt the kind of helplessness they'd made me live through. So, I started with Harper. The man who bought me. The man whose name haunted my nightmares. When I stood face to face with the man who once owned me, I didn't see fear in his eyes. I saw recognition. He knew exactly who I was, and that made it even sweeter. A promise in the dark. They say when you meet your monster again, you either tremble or smile. I smiled. Because the man who once bought me like an object was now sitting across from me, unaware that the woman he was negotiating with was the same little girl he had destroyed 17 years ago. Harper Lewis. The name alone was enough to make my blood boil. But when I saw him in person, age had done its work. His hair was gray, his hands shook slightly when he signed documents. But his eyes, those same cruel, calculating eyes, they hadn't changed. Monsters don't grow old. They just get richer. He was now the CEO of a private security firm, pretending to be a respectable businessman. But beneath the surface, I'd found links to trafficking, illegal labor contracts, and falsified documents, all the same poison he'd used to build his empire. I'd spent months preparing for this meeting, creating a fake identity, Evelyn Cross, the sharp-tongued legal consultant with a flawless record. He thought I was there to help him with a business audit. In reality, I was studying him. Every twitch, every smile, every weakness. When I walked into his office, he looked at me a little too long. "You look familiar," he said. I smiled. "Maybe you've seen me in your nightmares." He chuckled, unaware how close I was to the truth. For weeks, I worked under his company, gaining access to confidential files, employee records, offshore accounts. The deeper I dug, the darker it got. He wasn't just corrupt. He was running the same kind of operation that had stolen my childhood, selling children under the guise of adoption networks. And that's when I found her. A file labeled Project Lily. Inside were photos, receipts, and contracts, and one of them had my sister's name. She was alive. But she wasn't free. Finding that file changed everything. I wasn't just planning revenge anymore, I was preparing for war. But I couldn't rush. If Harper suspected anything, he'd vanish, just like before. So, I played my role perfectly, the loyal consultant, the quiet observer. Until one evening, after everyone left, I copied every document related to Project Lily onto a flash drive. As I was about to leave, his voice echoed behind me. "Working late, Evelyn?" I froze. He was standing in the doorway, smirking. For a moment, I thought he knew. But he just walked closer, lowering his tone. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Same fire in the eyes. I met his gaze. "Maybe she's here for you." He laughed, turned, and left. If only he knew how right I was. That night, I sat in my apartment with the flash drive in hand, tears streaming down my face as I opened file after file. Each child had a number. Each one had been sold, just like me. But when I saw my sister's picture, I broke. She was 15 when they took her. 17 now. And alive somewhere in Harper's network. I whispered her name again and again, Lily. That was her name. The name our mother gave her. And the name I'd use to destroy everyone who betrayed us. I sent the files anonymously to an international task force. It was only a matter of time before Harper's empire began to crumble. But I wasn't satisfied. He needed to look me in the eyes when everything he built turned to ash. Days later, I requested a private meeting with Harper, claiming I'd found a potential breach in his accounts. He agreed, curious. When he entered the room, I locked the door behind him. The air turned heavy. He sat down, amused. "You look tense, Evelyn." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Do you remember a girl you bought 17 years ago? 10 years old. Brown hair. Green eyes." His smile faded. He studied my face, and realization hit him like thunder. "You," he whispered. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking into a cold smile. "Me." He stammered, trying to speak, but I cut him off. "You destroyed my childhood. You made me forget what love meant. But I'm not that little girl anymore. And guess what, Harper, I found Lily." His eyes widened. For the first time, I saw fear. Real fear. Not for what I might do, but for what I already had done. He lunged toward me, but I stepped back, pressing a button on my recorder. "You're finished," I said calmly. "Every file, every name, every transaction, the world will know." He growled, "You'll regret this." I smiled. I already did. For 17 years. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. The police raided his properties within days. His name hit the headlines, his empire shattered, his investors vanished. And as I watched the news, I whispered one thing under my breath. "This is for Lily." But revenge wasn't over. Harper was just the beginning. The real betrayal came from home. And it was time to go there. When I stood on the porch of the house that sold me, I realized revenge wasn't as simple as I thought. Because they weren't just guilty, they were hiding something far worse. Return of the Forgotten Daughter. 17 years. That's how long it took for me to return to the house that sold me. But when I stood in front of it again, it wasn't just anger I felt, it was grief. Because the home I remembered was gone. All that remained was a rotting shell of betrayal. The paint had peeled off the wooden walls, the porch creaked with every step, and the yard that once smelled of jasmine was now overrun with weeds. I took a deep breath. The air was heavy, stale with memories I had spent years trying to bury. It was late evening. The sun was setting behind the hills, turning the house gold for a brief moment, almost beautiful, before darkness swallowed it again. How fitting, I thought. Even this house only looked good from a distance. My fingers trembled as I knocked on the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of slow footsteps. When the door opened, I froze. It was my mother. Her hair was gray, her face wrinkled, but those eyes I used to love, I'd know them anywhere. Except now, they looked at me like I was a stranger. "Yes?" she asked weakly. I smiled politely. "Hello, ma'am. I'm looking for a woman named Sarah Miller." Her eyes widened slightly. "That's me. What's this about?" I took a deep breath. "It's about your daughter." Her hands trembled. "My daughter? I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," I said softly. And before she could respond, I stepped inside. The living room was filled with old photographs, family portraits, faded and cracked. I scanned them quietly. There was one picture of me, or rather, the girl I used to be. 10 years old, smiling in a summer dress. It was framed. For a second, I almost believed she missed me. But then, I noticed something strange. Next to my photo was another girl's picture. Younger. Softer features. It was Lily. My chest tightened. "She was your daughter too," I whispered. My mother turned pale. Who are you? I met her eyes. I'm the girl you sold. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. I thought you were dead, she whispered. You hoped I was dead, I corrected her. Tears welled up in her eyes. We had no choice. There's always a choice, I snapped. And you chose money. I could feel the years of anger burning inside me like wildfire, but I didn't raise my voice. I wanted her to feel every word. Calmly. Coldly. She covered her face. He said you'd have a better life. He lied, I said. And you believed him because it was easier than believing you were a bad mother. For the first time, I noticed how fragile she looked, like guilt itself had aged her. But pity has no place in revenge. Then, I asked the question that had haunted me for years. Where is Lily? Her eyes widened again, real panic this time. She never came back, she whispered. He promised he'd bring her home after a few years, but... I slammed my hand on the table. You sold her too. You knew what he was doing. She sobbed uncontrollably. We needed money. Your father lost his job. We were starving. And so you sold your children, I said. Each word was a dagger. I turned to the window, unable to look at her anymore. Outside, the wind howled, a fitting chorus for a dying truth. Then I said quietly, he's gone now. The man who bought us. I made sure of it. Her sobs stopped. Slowly, she lifted her head. What did you do? I smiled faintly. Justice. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. Because from this moment, the story stops being about revenge, and becomes about truth. Just then, the door opened again. My father walked in. Older. Thinner. Eyes hollow. He looked at me for a long moment before saying, You came back. There was no shock in his voice. Just quiet resignation. Yes, I said. Didn't expect your product to return, did you? He sighed heavily and sat down across from me. You can hate me all you want, but I did what I had to do. I stared at him, disbelief and disgust swirling together. You had to do it? I repeated. You didn't sell a car, you sold your daughter. His eyes hardened. You wouldn't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said coldly. You traded your guilt for comfort. And now you have neither. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Years of pain filled the room like smoke, thick and choking. Finally, he said, we lost everything after you were gone. I thought that was punishment enough. I stepped closer. Not yet. But it's coming. I took a small envelope from my bag and placed it on the table. Inside was a letter, copies of the legal charges, the files, the proof of what Harper had done. And at the bottom, a note. It said, Your sins found their way home. My mother's hands shook as she opened it. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. What are you going to do to us? Nothing, I said softly. Life already did. I just came to see the faces of the people who created my hell. I turned to leave. But before I could open the door, she whispered, Lily's alive. I froze. My heartbeat stopped for a moment. What? She came here 2 years ago, my mother said, trembling. She was looking for you. She wanted to find you. I thought I'd uncovered every secret. But when I found my sister, I realized, she wasn't the same girl I remembered, and she wasn't on my side. The truth they never wanted to face. I expected tears when I found Lily. I did not expect a stranger with my sister's face to look back at me, stone cold, guarded, and loyal to the very empire that stole her childhood. When my mother said Lily had come back 2 years ago, my hands went numb. The world slowed down until I was moving through it in a dream, walking the same cracked streets I once raced on, stepping inside a community center where lost children were supposedly helped. The woman at the desk looked up, and for a second my throat closed. Green eyes. A crooked nose like ours. The same stubborn jaw. But the softness I remembered as a child had been sanded away by years that had no mercy. "Are you Lily?" I asked, voice smaller than I intended. She studied me like I'd interrupted something private. Then she smiled, only the corners of her mouth, nothing reaching her eyes. "Do you have an appointment?" she said. Practical. Removed. Cold. My chest ached with the hope that this could be a reunion. I swallowed and said her name. "It's me." The words stopped. She didn't answer. Instead she rose, walked around the desk, and reached for my hand the way a nurse takes a patient's pulse, efficient, clinical. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. The whisper felt like a verdict. Lily's voice had an edge I didn't recognize. "You shouldn't have come back," she said again, but now there was anger beneath the caution. "You should have stayed where you were. It's safer." "You were taken," I said. "They sold you. Don't you?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Sold?" That's what they told themselves to sleep at night. I survived. I learned to make myself useful. I'm not a victim, Evelyn. I make decisions. Her certainty hit me like a blow. For a moment I could only hear my heartbeat. The memory of the farmhouse, the man's hands, the nights I cried alone, all went white-hot in the center of my chest. "You don't have to be part of him anymore," I pleaded. "I found the files. I brought you back." "Brought me back to what?" she cut in. "To a house that pretends to love and gouges you with guilt? To the people who sold us twice over? I saw them, Evelyn. I looked at them and I decided I would never go back to being small." Her words were an accusation and a shield. She'd built armor out of survival, and it clinked when she moved. What she didn't say, what she wouldn't say for a long, cold minute, was that Harper had made her useful. That he had given her a role, no, not a role, a purpose. She'd been taught to manage men, to read ledgers, to fend off investigators, to look someone in the eye and not blink. She'd been turned into an instrument. Slowly, the edges of the truth assembled themselves. When Harper's network fell and the raids happened, many of his employees scattered. Lily stayed. She consolidated what remained. She learned law and logistics and the art of silence. She was the person who could make a broken system look like a machine again. She had become the guardian of what Harper left behind. "When they came for him," she said quietly, "I rebuilt what he couldn't. Somebody had to keep people safe. You look at him as a villain, I look at him as a man who gave me tools to survive." Her voice trembled on the last syllable, but the conviction returned like iron. My hands clenched. I had spent years imagining the moment I would expose Harper and watch him crumble at my feet. I hadn't imagined finding my sister guarding his ashes. "You're protecting them," I whispered. "You're protecting the people who sold you." "I protect myself," she replied. "And I protect others who might otherwise be left to rot." That's not betrayal. That's choices. I had come here to demand answers and return with them in hand, like evidence. Instead I found that the moral lines I'd drawn were smudged and cracked. My desire for retribution slammed into my sister's need for survival, and the collision left both of us breathless. "How much did they pay you?" I asked, voice barely controlled. The question felt small and monstrous at once. She flinched, but did not yield. "They didn't pay me, Evelyn. They taught me how to be important. There's a difference." She looked at me with an exhaustion that was almost tender. "I don't know how to be your little sister. I only know how to be useful." I wanted to shake her and tell her she was my sister no matter what. Instead I realized she had been crafted into someone else by the same men who had bought our childhoods. The system didn't only steal children, it reshaped them into guards of the same darkness. That was the extent of Harper's cruelty. He made victims who became guardians. I asked her about our parents. She told me they'd been consumed by shame and poverty after we were gone. They'd begged, stolen, and prayed. When Harper's men returned with offers, our parents took them because they were convinced it would be temporary. When it wasn't, guilt had turned them into quiet things in the house, blaming themselves into silence. Lily's tone softened when she said their names. They thought they were saving us in some twisted way, she said. I don't forgive them. I just understand that desperation is a teacher. Understanding. Not forgiveness. Not alliance. Over the next week I watched Lily at work. She moved through rooms with the brisk confidence of someone who had been trained to be indispensable, calm, decisive, suspicious of softness. She negotiated contracts with men who had once thought nothing of children's lives. She resigned to the practical, feeding people, ensuring shelter, turning the remnants of Harper's network into a shadow NGO that sheltered vulnerable people while skimming funds to survive. It was brutal pragmatism disguised as charity. What I wanted, what I had trained myself for, was a public burn, courts, headlines, the humbling of a family and a monster. Instead I faced a cat and mouse of loyalties and compromises. My sister's life complicated the neatness of my anger. Her survival was not a betrayal in the simple way I wanted it to be. One night, after a long argument that frayed both of us raw, Lily took my hands and said, "You won. You made them fall. But your victory didn't fix me or them. It just left a hole. I filled it the only way I could." Her palms were calloused. Her voice broke. My plan for revenge, beautiful, clean, merciless, was suddenly messy and human. For a second, I felt something I hadn't allowed in years, doubt. Not about whether they deserved to pay, but about what I would do when the names were burned and the people remained. By the time I left Lily's apartment that night, I knew the last piece of my plan would not be as straightforward as I'd imagined. She wasn't a tool to be pulled out and used. She was a person shaped by monsters into the kind of woman the world would mistake for its savior. When I walked away, I felt the old promise shift under my feet. This time, revenge would have to account for what my sister had become, and for the tangled, ugly truth my family had buried in silence. Revenge felt righteous when I planned it alone. But when lives were tangled with the faces of those I loved, the final move had to be smarter than anger, cleaner than violence, and more terrifying than anything they expected. The revenge they deserved. Revenge is never just one moment. It's a series of choices that build until one move makes the house of lies collapse. I had rehearsed mine for years, but the final act demanded more than fury. It demanded precision, mercy, and cruelty measured like a surgeon's cut. By the time I was ready to return to the people who had sold me, everything had shifted. Harper's public fall left splinters, legal battles, broken trusts, and a dozen quiet faces trying to rebuild. My parents were smaller than memory. My sister was a fortress with a human heart hidden behind battlements. I could have walked in and burned the world down, but destruction doesn't always heal broken things. It often leaves ash that the next generation must live on. So I crafted a different kind of justice, one that would expose them, strip away every comfortable lie, and give the law the evidence it needed to act. I wanted them to feel the slow dawning of disgrace, the same hollow shame that had hollowed me at 10 years old. Step 1. Isolate each player. I started with my parents. I had already placed the legal files where they couldn't be ignored. I'd also arranged discreet interviews with people who remembered the nights they sold children for food, neighbors, a priest who'd been bribed into silence, a man who'd delivered a child trucked from our county. I let the facts accumulate like a slow avalanche. I visited my father first. He was on the porch when I arrived, hands folded over his knees, unable to look me in the face. He expected threats. Instead, I sat beside him and let silence do the work. When he finally spoke, his voice was brittle. "We thought it would stop suffering," he said. "We thought we were saving the rest." The words were thin paper against the weight of memory. "You chose comfort," I replied, quietly. "You chose to trade me for a promise." He lowered his head. "I was afraid. That was your choice, I said. And choices have consequences. I didn't shout. I gave him something worse, the knowledge that everyone would know. I handed him a printed copy of the documentation, receipts, photos, ledger entries. He read them with both hands shaking. I watched guilt do what time never could, consume him. For my mother I offered no mercy. She had looked at my face and told herself we had no choice. I told her about Lily, how she'd returned and become a guardian of the very machine that had stolen us. The confession broke her in ways prison never could. She begged for forgiveness, I asked for truth. It was the only currency left between us. Step 2. Expose the network that survived Harper. Lily had become an anchor in that gray world, protecting people who could not protect themselves but also allowing corruption to survive under the guise of aid. I confronted her with a humane but unrelenting plan: either help me dismantle the remnants of Harper's empire from within, exposing every last ledger and safe house, or I would make her complicit crimes public and watch the legal machinery consume her. She looked at me the way one looks at an old friend turned enemy, tired, wary, and unexpectedly human. You want me to betray the people who rely on me, she said. You want a clean victory. No, I said. I want justice. Clean or not, it will be honest. She agreed, but on one cold condition: we do it without destroying the children who still relied on the network's sheltering functions. She would show me the lines where aid ended and corruption began. I would take those seams to the authorities and to the press, but protect those who were truly vulnerable. It was a compromise of ethics and survival, ugly, necessary. Together we compiled a dossier so comprehensive it read like a map of crimes across borders: forged documents, transfer logs, payments to politicians, and names of those who traded in children as if they were livestock. Lily's knowledge made the file devastating. My legal angles turned it into prosecutable evidence. I leaked the dossier to a journalist I trusted and to an international task force that had once failed to act quickly enough. Within days, cameras arrived at the courthouse. Reporters crowding steps. My parents' faces splashed across screens. The priest who once bowed his head and accepted bribes spoke on camera and wept openly. The community could no longer pretend ignorance. Watching their humiliation from a chair in the back of the courtroom, I expected a maelstrom of revenge to wash me clean. Instead, what flowed was more complex. I watched my father's shoulders fold under the weight of public shame, and I watched my mother sit like a broken thing, her hands clasped in her lap. They were held accountable, not by my hands, but by the world I had forced to look. Harper's former lieutenants were indicted. Some fled. Some tried to bargain. A handful, including men who had watched children like merchandise, confessed. Lily testified in part, her voice steady but not triumphant. She did not plead innocence, she spoke of survival and of the choices she'd made to keep people alive. Her testimony complicated the narrative, and that complexity saved lives that would have been collateral if we'd simply burned everything. The final scene unfolded in the same dusty backroom where, years ago, I had whispered a vow into a cracked ceiling tile. This time, I stood with my sister and watched as my parents were led away, not as prisoners of vengeance, but as citizens facing the criminal process their choices had produced. I felt vindicated, but not healed. Justice can cast light into corners, but it cannot replace what was stolen. I had taken back what I could: the truth, the file, the public reckoning. I had given Lily a shot at reclaiming herself on her own terms. I had stopped the men who traded children from doing so in secrecy. What I had not done was erase the years I had lost. Some things are irrecoverable. But I had changed the story's ending. I had ensured the next generation would not grow up feeding on secrets. In the quiet after the storm, Lily and I walked the edge of the river where we used to play as children. The water moved the same way it always had, indifferent and honest. We didn't reconcile with gestures or grand words. Instead, we sat side by side, sharing small silences that felt like progress. "Did you want to burn them?" she asked finally. For a moment, I admitted. But burning never brought her back. I tapped my chest where the scar sat, an old map to a younger life. This was better. Slower. harder. More like justice than anger. She leaned her head on my shoulder, not because everything was fixed, but because we were no longer walking separate roads. The past would always be a place we both carried, but now it had been named, exposed, and set in motion toward accountability. When I left that night, I did not feel triumphant. I felt real. The ache softened into something I could live with. The promise I had made to myself in a corner of a farmhouse, that I would return and make them feel what I felt, was fulfilled in a way I had not anticipated. They did feel it, the slow, public unwinding of their lies. Revenge, I learned, can be ruthless without being cruel. It can seek remedy rather than spectacle. It can turn pain into protection for others. That was the revenge they deserved. We cannot retrieve lost years, but we can make sure no one else loses theirs to silence. That is the kind of revenge that lasts.